Got a small chest? Don't worry, because mine was too.
In fact, over the last 6 months, I went from an A cup to a solid C with just minor tweaks in my form.
For example, I'm sure you've heard people say, including myself, that the best way to press is with your elbows at 45 degrees. I now think this is 100% incorrect, and the reason my chest didn't grow.
What?
Also, if you're someone whose anterior delts constantly jump in, it isn't because your delts are so dominant. They probably suck too. It's actually a postural issue that you can quickly fix. To help understand exactly what you've been doing wrong, we need to look at the anatomy of the pec itself. Now, we've previously gone over the sternocostal head, and based upon cadaver studies, there's actually 7 functional segments, but that's not what I want you to focus on today. The biggest aha moment comes when you start to study how it inserts into the crest of the greater tubercle of the humerus. Right there. I've heard people say that a muscle contracts from the insertion to the origin, but that's incorrect because the myosin and actin throughout the muscle all contract simultaneously, and what determines what moves is based upon what's fixed. Your sternum and your clavicle aren't going anywhere. The only thing that's going to move is the insertion. Now, interestingly, the 2 major heads of your pec actually contradict each other. Based upon fiber orientation, your clavicular head causes your arm to raise, while your sternocostal head causes it to lower. Now, in reality, they're not gonna work independently like that. I mean, yes, you can raise your arm and feel that your upper chest is contracted and actually still be able to jiggle your lower chest like it's an udder, but in most cases, they're gonna fire as one, and when they do, they create 2 completely separate actions. The first one being adduction of your arm, the second one internally rotating your humerus. And I'm sure you're sitting there thinking, wow, thank you for wasting my time with a basic anatomy lesson. But it was critical I explained those things because the moment I fully understood those 2 actions, as well as exactly where the pec inserted, was the moment I realized how badly I was screwing up my chest training. You see, for years, I thought the best way to train your chest was with your elbows at 45 degrees, because I've seen several case studies showing that gets the least amount of delt activation, and hell, I even bought EMG devices myself to test it, and yeah, that's the case, but my chest continued to suck. What I found out is that when you focus your training on trying to limit delt activation during your pressing movements, you end up putting less stress on your pec. And that's bad. And if you are somebody whose anterior delts constantly jump in, it's more of a sign of poor transverse thoracic mobility. And by the end of this video, we will fix that issue, I guarantee it. Started to go macho man there. Ooh, the cream will rise to the top. I was neglecting the most important part of any pressing movement. And that is the goal of any press is to create distance from the origin to the insertion and then contract it. At its best, a pressing movement is the safest and most effective way to overload the pec through a full range of motion and target specific sections based upon the angle at which you contract. Which means that if your biomechanics are in check and you have no structural limitations, then you should be looking to do the opposite of the primary action of the pec as you descend into the eccentric of a press, which again were adduction of your arm and internally rotating your humerus. Let's say I set up to do a press. Remember, the goal is to create distance from the origin to the insertion. If I set up at 45 degrees, you can see I'm not lengthening the muscle as much as I could based upon where it inserts. Hold on, let me get somebody else's boobs to help me explain. Yes, at 45 degrees, there's a deep stretch, but not in comparison. You can even see with Kate's 800cc bags of sand that there's a clear difference between here and a fully abducted arm. Also remember, one of the main things your pec wants to do is adduct. So why would we put it in a position that makes it easier for adduction? We should be trying to do the opposite. We should actually put it into abduction to create length. Now, I'm not saying you should try to force your elbows to your ears when you go into the eccentric of a press because that will create an impingement. But what I'm saying is that everybody's form goes through this natural progression. When everyone first starts out training, their form always looks the same. Doesn't matter if they're doing push-ups or presses, their elbows flare out to 90 degrees. That form is obviously horrible for your shoulders. At that angle, the glenohumeral head will jam into your acromion, and it's only a matter of time before it turns those rotator cuff muscles into and after you injure your shoulder enough times, you learn you should be keeping your elbow anywhere from 45 to 70 degrees to avoid any impingement. But if you're anything like me and you have genetically gifted triceps and a dog shit chest, it doesn't grow. Until one day you wake up and realize that maybe it's not such a bad thing, that much like my prick, the path that my elbows follow has a little curve to it. I've said too much. That means that if you do these correctly, you're going to be able to get the best of both worlds. By lowering the weight with your elbow started out at 45 degrees, you now minimize the risk of any potential impingement. And once you've cleared your acromion, you can abduct your arm even further, increasing the length and stretch on your pec muscle. Good job, bud. And not to beat a dead hooker, but I know some people are going to say, actually, the 45 degrees is a deep enough stretch for me, and it puts it on the perfect angle to hit those clavicular fibers. Two issues with that. The first one being, I'm sure you've been training like this for I don't know how many years. Is your upper chest overdeveloped yet? Probably not, because I don't think that's the most effective way to actually target those fibers. More on that later. The second issue being is this position for most people will cause their shoulders to tip forward and further internally rotate, causing those delts to jump in. That's not what we want. The next obvious question is, how do I know when it's safe to abduct or elevate my arm as I'm descending? It's a great question. The cool thing about making changes based upon anatomy is you can check your own biomechanics and see what works best for you. For example, if I put my arm up at 90 degrees and start to descend, I can feel the impingement happen about 2/3 of the way down. That lets me know that the abduction I'm doing should come in the last third of the movement, once I've already cleared that impingement. The next obvious question is, how much should your elbows abduct? To what degree? If you started at 45 degrees, where should they end up? The politically correct answer would be 70, but that's not what I do. As I approach the bottom, I really exaggerate the abduction because at that point there's no rotational force, so I'm not worried about any shearing, and it's almost like a side lateral because even if you do hit those neighbors above you, which is your rotator cuff muscles touching the acromion, it is just like a side lateral. It happens all the time, not a big deal. As long as you're not twisting and shearing, you're not going to create more shaved ice. One critical thing is you do have to make sure you maintain the same path. The one you went down on the eccentric is the same as the concentric. Otherwise, you will scratch some shit on the way out. I know for a lot of people, seeing the slight abduction of the arm isn't going to give you an aha moment. It's something you have to experience. The only thing I can relate it to is, you know when you're training biceps and you get that horrible debilitating pump, you can barely move it, and that's what stops you from training? That's what I've been able to develop with my chest by learning that simple movement with my elbow to really increase the stretch. Now I get those debilitating pumps and that mind muscle connection with my tits. Now we can't technically do the opposite of the second major action of the pec, which again was internally rotating your humerus. We're not going to be able to externally rotate it. That would create one awful looking press. But what we can do is engage our lower traps and our rhomboids to create additional length, but instead of horizontally this time, it's now going to be vertically. By pulling your shoulders back and down, it ensures that your chest is the prime mover. But this is key. There's two things I want you to look out for. The first one being, don't lock your shoulders into place. I grew up playing football, and I remember coaches drilling in your head, lock your shoulders in so you could bench press 135 2 whole times because in high school you were a puss. It's natural to have shoulder movement. How else do you think you're going to shorten the distance from your insertion to your origin if your shoulders are pinned all the way back? You fucking can't. The second being, do not arch your back. These benches are flat for a reason because it targets a specific area of fibers based upon the angle of the bench. When you arch, you're targeting the wrong fibers. If you're on a flat bench press, you're now going decline. And I say this from experience because up until a couple months ago, I used to lock myself into place, arch my back, and screw everything up. So let me walk you through how I set up every single press. The first thing I do is pull my shoulders back and down. But again, they're not locked into place. Pretend like you're 6 years old again and you got your Nintendo backpack on that looks like a Game Boy and you got a shitload of books in it. It's heavy, but you're not locked so much that you're trying to crack the top of your ass. From doing that, you're gonna inevitably get a slight arch. So when I lay back, I'm gonna try to push my belly button to the pad, flatten everything out, and now I'm ready to press. For a lot of people, the biggest problem they're gonna run into is being unable to pull those shoulders back. That's why Donnie Thompson's bow tie is such a great invention, but it's a tool, it's not a crutch, and not easy to get out of. It comes back to what I mentioned before, having poor transverse thoracic mobility. Now there's a couple ways you can self-identify if you have this problem. The first one being kinesthetic. If every time you train your chest, you feel it in your anterior delts, you probably can't create enough distance vertically to be able to bring your shoulders back and lead and take the load on your chest. The second test is whether or not you have pain. If one of your rhomboids feels like it constantly has a knife sticking out of it, I can pretty much pinpoint what you did. Over the course of your life, you determine that one side's better to tug with than the other, and you do it 2 to 3 times per day with a death grip, because who wants to use 2 fingers? That's just sad and lonely. But what it's done is cause that rhomboid to overstretch, overlengthen, and then spasm to try to protect itself, which causes the other side to overcompensate and shorten even more, which creates even more restriction to the transverse thoracic plane. But don't worry, we're going to fix it right now. The last test is partially a setup for one of the ways we're going to fix it. You're going to start out kneeling and put one forearm on the ground. The other hand's going to go behind your back. This is the side we're testing, and you're going to see visually with the camera in front of you how much you're able to open up that shoulder. And don't be surprised if one side's more restricted than the other. That's usually the way it works. The side you tug with is usually a little bit easier. The other side overcompensates and is stuck. Congratulations. I'm sure you were able to identify that you're screwed up. I'm gonna run through the 3 exercises I do before every workout, and I do it daily because I used to have rhomboid pain and I'm scared to death of it coming back. But even if you don't, I would do this before every chest workout just to make sure your shoulders are pulled back. I start off kneeling with one forearm on the ground, but my hand's gonna be on my head this time, and I try to create as much movement in that upper back as possible while driving through that forearm that's on the ground. You're gonna feel muscles you've never felt before. They've always been there, you just sucked at training them. 10 reps each side. And then I'm gonna grab a band, wrap it around something, and create distance because I want tension. I'm going to actively engage the serratus anterior by punching forward and then letting it relax and pull me even further. From there, I engage the rhomboid and pull it back. 10 reps on each side, 2 sets. The last one, I'm going to put that band around my shoulder, put my hand behind my back to force internal rotation, and then get distance to create tension. The goal with this one is to allow that band to force you into a deep stretch, and then engage that rhomboid, open up that shoulder, and really work that transverse thoracic mobility, which you've neglected your entire life. I mentioned I was going to tell you my favorite way to hit the upper chest, those clavicular fibers, and I know this is going to stir some shit because I've seen the most progress with this exercise, but the caveat being I had to fix my transverse thoracic mobility first. That way I can lead with my chest. What I do is hop on the Smith machine and actually increase the angle of the bench to make it even steeper. As I go into the negative, I force those shoulders to abduct to really increase the length of that pec, and as I contract up, your elbows will naturally adduct, so you don't really have to think about it, but just make sure you don't keep them flared out the whole time because that won't work. And again, the reason I think this works is we're forcing the chest to lengthen as much as humanly possible. So try it for yourself and see how you like it. Or don't and continue to look like shit. I don't care. As always, programs are linked below. Get after it and get growing.
What are you saying, ABD?
I'm saying add. That's why I gotta make sure I say
Why don't
it.
you say ADD duction?
Because that's
Not your style.
what disabled people do.